March 3rd, 1944, 4:38 in the morning. The Hukong Valley lay wrapped in fog so thick a man could taste it, metallic and damp, coating the tongue like river water. Private First Class Daniel Boone. Yes, that was his actual name, inherited from a grandfather who claimed descent from the original frontiersman, pressed himself against the wet bark of a teak tree, his M1 Garand resting in the crook of his arm. The jungle breathed around him, a symphony of insect clicks and bird calls that meant nothing to trained soldiers from Tokyo or Osaka, but spoke volumes to a boy from the Tennessee hills who had spent 18 years tracking white-tailed deer through autumn timber. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Japanese soldiers from the 18th Division were moving, elite infantry trained in mountain warfare. Men who believed the jungle belonged to them, that these thick forests and razor-edged ridges were terrain where Asian soldiers held every advantage over soft Americans who grew up with electric lights and indoor plumbing. The Japanese were wrong. They would learn this over the next 72 hours. But the lesson would cost them more than 400 dead. Bodies scattered across muddy trails and burned-out supply dumps, killed by men they had dismissed as farmer boys, as children playing at war. The Hukong Valley Campaign of early 1944 represented a critical phase in the Allied effort to reopen land routes to China and push Japanese forces from northern Burma. For 2 years, Imperial Army units had controlled this territory, using the dense jungle and mountainous terrain to establish defensive networks that had repelled Chinese attacks and stalled British advances. The Japanese 18th Division, veterans of campaigns in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, had earned a reputation for jungle expertise, for the ability to move silently through terrain that immobilized conventional forces to appear suddenly and strike with devastating effect before melting back into the forest. Their mountain infantry battalions trained specifically for operations in rough terrain, learning fieldcraft and camouflage as spiritual disciplines, enduring harsh physical conditioning that broke weaker soldiers, studying the principles of Bushido that demanded absolute commitment and contempt for enemy forces who lacked similar tradition. When Japanese scouts first observed American troops moving through the valley in February 1944, they reported back with confidence bordering on dismissal. These Americans from the 5307 Composite Unit, soon to be known as Merrill's Marauders, looked nothing like proper soldiers. Many were young, barely out of their teens. They moved clumsily through the jungle at first, struggling with equipment, sweating profusely in the tropical heat. Intelligence reports noted that large numbers came from rural backgrounds, farms and small towns, places with no military tradition, no warrior culture. The Japanese officers read these reports and smiled. Farmers, boys who had never faced hardship, never known true discipline. The coming engagement would be a massacre, a demonstration of what happened when soft Americans encountered hardened Japanese infantry. What the Japanese scouts failed to understand, what their intelligence officers could not conceptualize because it existed outside their framework of military experience, was that these farmer boys brought skills to the jungle that no amount of formal military training could replicate. Daniel Boone had killed his first deer at age 9, had tracked wounded animals through November snow for miles, reading sign that was invisible to untrained eyes, learning patience and stillness as survival skills rather than martial philosophy. Private James McCarty from Montana had worked as a hunting guide, spending months each year in wilderness that would have killed unprepared men, navigating by terrain features and star positions, understanding how to move silently and observe without being observed. Corporal William Henderson from Michigan had competed in regional shooting competitions, had put thousands of rounds through rifles at ranges from 50 to 500 yards, developing the kind of marksmanship that came not from military drill, but from years of practice where every shot mattered because ammunition was expensive and game was scarce. The 5,307th Composite Unit had formed in late 1943 from volunteers drawn largely from Army units stationed in the American Southwest and Pacific Coast. The recruitment criteria were specific. Single men between 21 and 35, with preference given to those with backgrounds as rangers, lumberjacks, woodsmen, hunters, prospectors, and game wardens. The Army wanted men who could survive behind enemy lines in harsh terrain, who possessed constitution and practical skills that went beyond what could be taught in basic training. These were not parade ground soldiers. They were men who understood land and weather, and how to stay alive in places where civilization had no foothold. Training at camps in India emphasized skills these men already possessed, but had never applied in military context. Special emphasis was placed on jungle lane marksmanship, firing at pop-up targets and moving silhouettes using small arms, developing the ability to acquire targets rapidly and shoot accurately under stress. For soldiers like Boone and McCarty, this was familiar work translated into new language. Shooting a pop-up target at 80 yards while moving through brush was fundamentally identical to taking a deer that bolted from cover. The same calculation of distance and lead, the same steady trigger press, despite elevated heart rate and moving feet. The training instructors were often surprised by how quickly these rural volunteers mastered techniques that took urban soldiers weeks to learn. The Japanese expected bayonet charges to break American lines. Their military doctrine, derived from experiences in China where poorly trained Chinese troops broke under aggressive close-quarters assault, emphasized melee combat as the ultimate expression of warrior spirit. Japanese infantrymen trained extensively with bayonets, viewing the weapon as a modern equivalent of the samurai sword, a tool that required not just physical skill, but spiritual commitment. They had used these tactics successfully against Chinese forces that lacked discipline and firepower, waves of screaming soldiers closing distance rapidly and engaging in hand-to-hand combat, where the Japanese martial training provided decisive advantage. The first clash came before dawn on March 3rd near WWII, a town that American intelligence believed was lightly held, but which Japanese forces had reinforced with elements of the 18th Division. The marauders had moved into blocking positions during the night, guided by Kachin scouts who knew the terrain intimately, positioning themselves across Japanese supply routes with interlocking fields of fire. When Japanese patrols encountered these positions at first light, they reported back that American forces were present in unknown strength. The division commander ordered a reconnaissance in force, a probing attack designed to identify American positions and strength before committing to full assault. The reconnaissance force consisted of approximately 200 infantry from a mountain battalion, soldiers trained specifically for operations in this terrain, men who had fought in Malaya and Burma for 2 years. They moved confidently through the jungle approaches, using standard dispersal patterns, expecting to encounter American positions that would respond with suppressing fire, creating opportunities for flanking movements and close assault. What they encountered instead was silence, absolute stillness, and then sudden, devastating precision fire from ranges that should not have been effective in jungle conditions. Daniel Boone spotted the first Japanese soldier at 140 yards. A shadow moving between trees, visible for perhaps 2 seconds before disappearing behind foliage. Boone did not fire. He watched. He waited. He understood that deer traveled in groups, that seeing one meant others were nearby, that patience revealed patterns. 20 seconds later, he saw another soldier, then another. Movement along a trail that was barely visible, but which represented the natural route through this section of jungle. Boone aimed at a gap in the foliage where the trail passed between two large trees. He exhaled half a breath and waited. When the next soldier appeared in that gap, Boone fired. The M1 Garand cracked once, sharp and definitive. The Japanese soldier fell. Before his body hit the ground, 5 other marauders had acquired targets and begun firing. Each shot carefully aimed, each one dropping a Japanese soldier before he could identify where the fire was coming from. The Japanese reconnaissance force took 17 casualties in the first 30 seconds of contact. The survivors went to ground, taking cover behind trees and in drainage ditches, trying to understand what had happened. They had expected American positions to reveal themselves with volume of fire, multiple soldiers shooting simultaneously from fixed positions, creating noise and muzzle flash that would pinpoint locations. Instead, they had encountered single shots from multiple directions, precision fire that killed or wounded with each round, coming from positions that were invisible even after firing. The surviving Japanese sergeant ordered his men to advance by pairs, using cover and suppressing fire to close distance. This was standard doctrine, proven tactics that had worked against British and Chinese forces. Against the marauders, it was suicide. James McCarty watched the Japanese pairs begin their advance. He recognized the pattern immediately, had seen elk move similarly through timber, coordinated movement where one animal watched while another moved. McCarty did not try to hit the moving soldiers. He aimed at the positions where they would stop, the natural cover points that any intelligent fighter would use. When a Japanese soldier dove behind a fallen log, McCarty's round was already in flight, striking the man in the upper chest as he settled into position. The soldier died without firing a shot. McCarty worked the M1's trigger again, acquired another target, fired. 8 shots, 8 separate trigger presses, and when the Garand's distinctive ping announced an empty clip, 6 Japanese soldiers were dead or dying. The Japanese had trained for 27 months in some cases, had endured physical hardships that would have broken weaker men, had studied military tactics and Bushido principles under officers who represented generations of warrior tradition. None of this prepared them for American soldiers who shot like competition marksmen, who understood concealment and fieldcraft at levels that matched or exceeded Japanese expertise, who brought a different kind of hardness to combat, not spiritual or philosophical, but practical. The hardness that came from survival in environments that offered no mercy to the unprepared. The reconnaissance force broke after losing half its strength without inflicting a single American casualty. The survivors withdrew in disorder, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead, reporting back that they had encountered American positions of unknown strength defended by soldiers who shot with impossible accuracy. The division commander did not believe the initial reports. American soldiers were not marksmen. American tactics relied on firepower and maneuver, on artillery and air support, not individual shooting skill. He ordered a larger attack, committing an entire battalion, 400 men who would overwhelm these American positions through weight of numbers and aggressive assault. The attack began at midday. Japanese infantry advancing in coordinated waves, using covering fire and movement to close distance. The marauders waited until the Japanese were within 200 yards before opening fire. The volume was devastating, not because of automatic weapons or machine guns, but because virtually every marauder was firing at a sustainable rate of one aimed shot every 3 to 4 seconds. And virtually every shot was hitting a target. William Henderson fired his M1 Garand 64 times during the engagement. He counted afterward, calculating rounds expended versus targets hit. 51 of those shots had struck Japanese soldiers. Some were kills, some were wounds, but the ratio was extraordinary. nearly 80% accuracy under combat conditions against moving targets in jungle terrain. Henderson was not unique. Across the marauder positions, soldiers who had grown up hunting for food rather than sport, who had learned to make every shot count because wasted ammunition meant going hungry, were achieving hit rates that exceeded anything in standard Army doctrine. The Japanese battalion took 270 casualties before breaking contact and withdrawing. American casualties numbered 14 wounded, none killed. Over the next 72 hours, the pattern repeated with variations. Japanese forces attempted to flank marauder positions, to infiltrate during darkness, to use their superior numbers and tactical experience to overcome American firepower. Each attempt failed. The marauders, guided by Kachin scouts who moved through the jungle like spirits, repositioned constantly, setting ambushes along Japanese supply routes, interdicting communications, striking and vanishing before Japanese forces could respond effectively. The sound of M1 Garands firing in controlled bursts became the dominant acoustic signature of the battle, distinct from the sharper crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles. A steady rhythm that announced American positions were active, and Japanese soldiers were dying. The Japanese began to understand that they had fundamentally misjudged their enemy. These were not soft Americans who would break under pressure. These were soldiers who moved through jungle with confidence, who shot with accuracy that matched or exceeded Japanese marksmen, who understood fieldcraft and small unit tactics at levels that formal military training struggled to teach. The mockery that Japanese scouts had expressed in early February transformed into cautious respect by mid-March, then into something approaching fear as casualty reports mounted and attacks continued to fail. The transformation was not limited to Japanese perception. The marauders themselves underwent a psychological shift during the Wallabum engagement. Many had entered combat wondering if their rural skills would translate to warfare. If hunting deer in Tennessee truly prepared a man for killing enemy soldiers in Burma. The answer was definitive. Every skill they had learned in American forests and mountains applied directly to jungle combat. The patience required to wait motionless in a deer stand for hours translated to ambush discipline. The ability to read terrain and anticipate animal movement translated to tactical awareness. The marksmanship developed through years of practice, where every shot mattered economically translated to combat effectiveness that formal military training could not replicate quickly. The M1 Garand became the symbolic object that represented American abundance and industrial capacity. The Japanese infantry carried Arisaka Type 99 bolt-action rifles, weapons that required manual cycling after each shot. Reliable but slow. The M1 Garand was semi-automatic, firing as rapidly as the shooter could pull the trigger, holding 8 rounds compared to the Arisaka's 5. But the true advantage was not mechanical. The advantage was that American soldiers had access to unlimited ammunition for training, had fired thousands of practice rounds before ever entering combat, had developed muscle memory and marksmanship skills through repetition that Japanese soldiers could not match because their military system rationed ammunition and emphasized bayonet training over shooting.
The sound of the Garand's action cycling, the metallic click-clack as the bolt stripped another round from the clip and chambered it, became a recurring audio signature in American memories of the campaign. That sound meant American firepower was active, that Japanese attacks were being repelled, that farm boys from Tennessee and Montana and Michigan were proving their worth in the most brutal way possible. Japanese soldiers learned to fear that sound, to associate it with sudden death from ranges they had thought were safe, with attacks that dissolved into casualties before they could close to bayonet distance. By March 7th, the Marauders had killed an estimated 400 to 500 Japanese soldiers from the 18th Division at Wallaboom alone, cutting off Japanese supply lines and forcing a general withdrawal. The tactical victory was significant, but the psychological impact was greater. Japanese military doctrine, built on assumptions of racial and martial superiority, on the belief that Asian soldiers possessed advantages in jungle warfare that Western troops could not overcome, had collided with reality and shattered. The Americans who had been mocked as farmer boys had demonstrated skills that formal military training could not replicate, had brought a different kind of expertise to combat, one rooted in practical experience rather than martial philosophy. The lesson spread through both armies. Japanese intelligence reports began to note that American forces in Burma included specialized units with exceptional marksmanship and fieldcraft skills, that assumptions about American military incompetence needed revision. American commanders recognized that the recruitment criteria for the Marauders, men with hunting and wilderness backgrounds, had produced a unit whose capabilities exceeded conventional infantry in specific terrain. This recognition would influence later Special Operations Unit formations, the understanding that some military skills could not be taught efficiently but could be recruited, that men who had lived close to land and survival brought advantages that boot camp could not create in 12 weeks.
The Marauders continued operations through May 1944, suffering increasingly from disease and exhaustion as supply difficulties and Japanese pressure took their toll. But their reputation was established. They had gone into Burma as an untested unit, mocked by Japanese scouts as farmer boys playing at war. They emerged as one of the most effective infantry forces in the theater. Men who had killed thousands of Japanese soldiers while inflicting disproportionate casualties, who had proven that American abundance meant not just industrial capacity, but the luxury of unlimited practice, of developing skills to levels that resource-constrained militaries could not match. Daniel Boone survived the Burma campaign, returned stateside in late 1944, and went back to Tennessee. He did not speak extensively about what he had done at Wallaboom, about the Japanese soldiers he had killed with precision shots through jungle foliage. Men of his generation rarely did. The war was something that had required doing, something that proved certain skills mattered, but not something that warranted constant examination. He hunted deer for the rest of his life, returning to mountains and forests where the stakes were lower, but the skills remained identical. The ability to move silently, to read terrain, to shoot accurately under pressure. These were not military skills grafted onto civilian experience. They were civilian skills that had proven devastatingly effective when applied to military necessity. The Japanese 18th Division withdrew from the Hukong Valley, fell back to new defensive positions, and eventually was destroyed piecemeal over the following year as American and Chinese forces pushed south through Burma. The soldiers who survived Wallaboom carried stories about American marksmanship that contradicted everything they had been taught about Western military inferiority. Some wrote letters home describing encounters with enemy soldiers who shot like trained hunters rather than conscripts, who understood jungle movement and concealment at levels that matched elite Japanese units. These letters rarely survived the war, but their contents influenced Japanese tactical doctrine in later campaigns. Increased caution about dismissing American capabilities. Recognition that assumptions about racial and cultural military superiority were dangerously incomplete. The M1 Garand rifles that American soldiers carried through the Hukong Valley represented industrial capacity that Japan could not match. The ability to equip millions of soldiers with semi-automatic weapons while enemy forces still relied on bolt-action rifles developed decades earlier. But the rifles themselves were only tools. The effectiveness came from the men who wielded them, from soldiers who had fired thousands of practice rounds at targets in American forests, who had developed marksmanship not as a military skill, but as a life skill, necessary for putting food on tables in rural communities where hunting was survival rather than sport. Freedom, in this context, meant the space for individual skill to matter, for soldiers to bring civilian expertise into military service and have that expertise recognized and utilized. Japanese military culture emphasized conformity and collective discipline, trained soldiers to follow doctrine regardless of individual ability, created systems where questioning orders or suggesting alternative approaches was tantamount to insubordination. American military culture, for all its own rigidity and problems, left more room for individual initiative, for recognizing that some soldiers brought skills that exceeded what training manuals could teach, for allowing those skills to influence tactics and operations. The farmer boys that Japanese scouts mocked in February 1944 proved something essential about how free societies fight wars. They proved that abundance creates opportunity for skill development that scarcity cannot match, that unlimited practice ammunition and leisure time for hunting produces marksmen that rationed resources and bayonet drill cannot replicate. They proved that democratic systems, which value individual initiative, can harness civilian skills for military purposes in ways that rigid, hierarchical cultures struggle to achieve. They proved that mockery based on assumptions about class and background was often a prelude to devastating miscalculation. March 1944. The Hukong Valley rang with the sound of M1 Garands firing in controlled bursts. American soldiers who had learned to shoot as children, killing Japanese infantrymen who had trained for years in formal military schools. The engagement lasted 72 hours and cost the Japanese 18th Division 500 casualties and forced a general withdrawal. It cost the Marauders 23 wounded and proved that farmers and hunters and small-town boys could outfight elite mountain troops when they brought the right skills to the right terrain. The lesson echoed through military doctrine for decades afterward. The understanding that some combat skills cannot be taught efficiently but must be recruited. That men who live close to land and survival bring advantages that boot camp and drill cannot replicate. That abundance and freedom produce capabilities that authoritarian systems built on scarcity and conformity cannot match. The jungle reclaimed Walaubum long ago, vegetation covering the trails where Japanese soldiers fell to precision rifle fire, streams washing away evidence of battle. But the memory persists in military history, in special operations recruitment criteria, in the understanding that expertise comes from unexpected places, that civilian skills matter in warfare, that mockery often precedes enlightenment. The farmer boys who the Japanese scouts dismissed in February proved themselves in March, and the proof was written in casualty reports and forced withdrawals and the transformation of tactical doctrine. They carried M1 Garands and rural childhoods into combat and emerged victorious, not because they were better soldiers in some abstract sense, but because they were better marksmen in a specific context, because they understood terrain and movement and shooting in ways that formal training struggled to teach, because they represented a different kind of military excellence, one built on practical experience rather than martial philosophy, on abundance rather than scarcity, on individual skill rather than collective conformity.